So take my hand and get me through. The grip of grace will hold me true, with hands that will shelter and heal. Oh, so take my hand.
Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Duncan Macleod. I'm here to host this morning's conversation with Steve Taylor. I'm a Presbytery Minister with the Port Phillip East Presbytery in Melbourne, Australia. And we welcome people from all across Australia and New Zealand and other parts of the world maybe as well. Today we have Steve, who is the principal of the Knox Centre for Ministry and Leadership in Dunedin, New Zealand. And Steve's also an adjunct faculty member, lecturer with Flinders University in Adelaide, and a adjunct faculty member with University of Otago in theology. So we're glad to have you here, Steve.
Thank you.
Two Kiwis today.
Yes.
A post-Kiwi and an emergent Kiwi. And we're actually missing the presence of our friend and colleague, Craig Mitchell, who's had to spend some time with his family, illness today. So we're the ones who are going to be holding this together today. So today is an interactive session. We're looking forward to the interaction with people on the Facebook group, and Craig is on there. Good to see you there, Craig. We're looking forward to an interaction through the next hour and a half. We'll be speaking. There'll be interaction points where we'll be asking for feedback from members of the Facebook group. We're looking at faith development today and a playful approach to that. And before we start talking about blended faith formation, and particularly about being a dispersed church at this time, and particularly in Australia with the COVID-19 situation, we want to begin with faith formation itself. So Steve, I'm going to hand over to you to get us started thinking about faith formation.
Well, firstly, it's lovely to be with you. I'm presuming that you can all see me. With technology, I can't see myself.
It's all happening, Steve. Yep.
It's all happening. Excellent. So good to be with you. May I start by saying first, on behalf of KCML and on behalf of the Presbyterian Church of Aotearoa, New Zealand, our special thoughts and prayers to you, particularly in Melbourne and in Victoria, as you wrestle with the second wave of COVID. We've been through our lockdown. We know a little bit about what it feels like. We haven't done a second wave. We hope we don't have to. But our thoughts and our prayers and our solidarity is with you on this occasion. It's one of the weird things about COVID is that it separates people, it distances us, it isolates us, but yet at the same time it actually connects us and resources us and brings us together. And so here we are talking together, and in various ways you've had international guests already, which is part of the other side, the positive side of what's happening as we, I think, learn in new ways and different ways to be together. In terms of faith formation, in terms of digital faith formation, in terms of what it means to do ministry in a more distant world, I start first by thinking about faith formation in general. I start first by thinking about faith formation in relation to ministry. And I understand that in terms of ministry, in terms of the Great Commission, and particularly helped by this book by Paul Avis, A Ministry Shaped by Mission. Paul is the General Secretary of the Council for Christian Unity, and so has a keen eye on what's happening worldwide and ecumenically in terms of faith formation. And so to understand ministry and faith formation, one place to start is the Great Commission. There are three verbs in the Great Commission. There's the making of disciples, there's the teaching, and then there's the going in terms of journeying together. And so applied to the task of ministry, the making of disciples is done in terms of sacraments of baptism and disciple making. The teaching is in relation to the word, so there's that ministry of word and sacrament, and it's put together in terms of that going or that primary mission sending. And so the sense that we're journeying together, we're not journeying alone, we're journeying with other disciples, and we're journeying with and in response to the mission of God, going, sending us into God's world. So that helps for me to order the church and to order ministry around those three verbs of making disciples, the sacramental ministry, teaching in terms of the word, and going in terms of disciple making and participation. And so therefore the theology of faith formation emerges in terms of what does it mean to be on a mission journey, and what is the roles of word and sacrament play in ordering that journey. Being aware that those roles are shared roles. There's particular ordering around the minister, but those are body gifts and body ways of ordering ourselves. And so that missional and communal and disciple-making framework helps me sort of understand and locate faith formation in general, and then would help as I drill down to think about digital faith formation, teaching people online, disciple-making online. So
Thanks,
handing
Steve.
back to you.
Okay, so one of the gurus around faith formation is Tom Groom, and he talks about passing on the faith as involving information, formation, and transformation. And when I think of formation, I think of how we learn discipleship by doing it in a community of disciples. And that leads me to thinking about the habits of practices of disciples. And I know that you're interested in spiritual practices and seeing those not just as internal, but as embodied and not just cloistered away as church practices out of sight, but also everyday practices and also as missional practices. So it seems that that being dispersed, not being able to gather in one place, has put a focus on being Christian at this time, not just in the church building, but also in everyday life. So, Steve, I'm wondering if you can reflect on some of the challenges that we have around thinking theologically and engaging with that whole environment of practices that might take us forward somewhere.
Yeah, so here in New Zealand, we had 48 hours to prepare for a full lockdown. And so you're looking around your office and you're thinking, what am I going to need to take with me in terms of working from home, cleaning out the work fridge, making sure there's nothing left behind in case in 6 weeks' time you return to a live growing organism. And one of the books I pulled off my shelf to take home was a Theology of the Holy Spirit, a selection of readings from across the global church. And there's a theologian in there in particular that I wanted to sit and spend some time with. His name is Rupert of Dutz. He was about the 11th century, a colleague or a collaborator alongside Hildegard of Bingen, an influential Benedictine theologian. His abbey was in Cologne, which is in Germany. And he was known as the first theologian of the Spirit in the Western Church. What that says about the first 11 centuries we can talk about at another time. But he wrote the first sort of systematic, if you like, theology of the Spirit. And what I want to do is to introduce a couple of quotes to you, which for me have been really interesting in terms of thinking through faith formation in a dispersed context and faith formation missionally. And I'd like to try and do it interactively. I'm not quite sure how this is going to go with Facebook response, but what I'd like to do is for us to do this as a sort of online faith formation practice of Lectio Divina. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put up a quote from Rupert of Dutz, and I'm going to read that quote. Then I'm going to hold a minute of silence. And then I'm going to ask people in the chat function of Facebook to write a word or a phrase from that piece of work by Rupert of Dutz that stops them, that interests them, that puzzles them, that intrigues them. Then I'm going to put up a second slide and we'll repeat that process. I'll read some Rupert of Dutz to you. We'll pause for a minute of silence, and then people will be invited to write a word or phrase from that second quote that stands out for them. And then perhaps we'll be able to hear some feedback from that a bit later on.
That sounds good. And while we're putting up that quote on the screen, I'm thinking that we can I know people are asking about the references to the books you've just referred to. And if you could just put that into the chat for me, I'll put it on Facebook.
Very good.
Yeah.
First, let me read to you some Rupert of Dutes. As the centurion Cornelius was shut out by Jews prohibiting Gentiles from receiving, to say nothing of the many baptized who, confessing Christ under persecution, were not able to reach the waters, were kept away by prisons and shackled with chains. At length the mother, the grace of God, who extends her wings beyond the nest of the waters, flies forth to her own, as the Holy Spirit swooped down upon all who were listening to the word when Peter was preached. A minute to hold ourselves in silence before God. So we're practicing Lectio. We are faith forming in a dispersed way. An invitation now for you on the Facebook feed, on the comments, to write down a word or a phrase that stands out for you from that quote from Rupert of Dutes. Give a couple of minutes for that to happen, and then I'll read the second quote.
Yeah. So looking forward to your comments in the Facebook feed chat, and we'll bring those back.
Duncan, what's the word or phrase that stood out for you?
The word that stood out for me was swooped down.
Yep.
And there's a sense of upon all who are listening to the word.
Mm-hmm.
And I just love that sense of this discovery of an experience that where there's a new way of seeing things because the Spirit has swooped down and given us a new way of seeing things. And it reminds me of all the birds around where I live, the currawongs and the trees around here swoop around, and it gives me a new way of seeing the world.
Yeah.
How about you, Steve?
For me, it was the this time in the Lectio, it was the phrase "beyond the nest." Yeah, and I was thinking about the safety of the nest, the comfort, and what it means for the spirit to be extended beyond that nest. And of course, the waters isn't the waters of Noah, isn't the waters of the creation of chaos. Is it the waters of the Red Sea? In all those places, those water images in Scripture, there is the Spirit beyond what is comfortable and working in different places.
Yes, good. Well, there's quite a few responses here. Bruce, the mother, the grace of God, and Wendy as well. Christine Palmer, extending her wings. Andrew Johnson, flies forth to her own. Lynn Aird also, the Holy Spirit swooped down. David Hyam, the mother, the grace of God, and Lindley Lesh like that as well. Catherine Nelson extends her wings. Bill Lang, at length. David Fotheringham, beyond the nest of the waters. A bit like you, Steve. Narelle Collis, those who are shut out, kept away and shackled. So there's beyond and swoop down. There's a lot of those people. The grace of God, at length, Wendy Snook. Judy, shut out and flies forth. Jill extends her wings. And Rob Hanks, shut out, kept away, shackled. Lindley Lash, the waters of baptism and belonging. So there's a lot of there's a lot of resonances there in that Lectio Divina with Rupert.
Yeah, it's interesting. So for me, what as I read this, I was fascinated by the way that the Spirit is the agent in baptism, which of course we all know, but the way that Rupert here constructs it so that the Spirit can still be at work even for those who are imprisoned, even for those who are shut away and shackled. Baptism could still happen, and the Spirit could still swoop. And there was a sense, therefore, that the Spirit could still connect the isolated individual believer with other believers in the worldwide church. And so I've begun to wonder if this might help me think theologically, pneumatologically, about what it means to be dispersed, that the Spirit of God is still active in the world. The Spirit of God is beyond the nest of the gathered church. The Spirit of God is beyond the nest of my home office where I sit and I broadcast from to you. The Spirit is active and alive in our world. And so we're not cut off because of the action and agency of the Spirit. And of course, therefore, there is some wonderings here, therefore, about sacramental theology, if we want to go there in our discussions a bit later on, because baptism is a sacrament in the same way that communion is a sacrament. And so is this just a unique theology just for people who are imprisoned, or might it be that in this unique COVID time that we find ourselves, the Spirit of God can be alive, swooping beyond our individualized engagement with communion to call us and to form us together as the body of Christ. So faith formation dispersed, I locate within this work and action and agency of the Spirit, who refuses to let distant people be isolated, but is alive and active.
Yeah, that's great.
Let me give you a second quote from Rupert of Dutz. And again, if we do the same thing, if again we practice faith formation online, again we do a dispersed lectio. And so I'll read it to you. We'll hold a minute's silence. People aren't allowed to use the chat for that minute. They're to sit in silence and hold that space. And then the invitation to be on chat and to engage together. This is Rupert of Dutz, his exegesis of Psalm 148. To see this, I say, before it came into being, was a game for God and God's wisdom, a festive game, a happy game, a delighting game. But truly to rejoice at such things, to see all this with a hilarity in greatness of heart, is the love of wisdom, a zealous love, a holy love, which we said earlier is the Holy Spirit. A minute to sit with this piece of theology. And so an invitation now for folk to again use the chat and write down a word, a phrase that stops them, that puzzles them, that absorbs them, that engages them. What was it for you, Duncan?
Well, the first phrase where game came into it, a game for God.
Mm-hmm.
And it reminded me of the sense of risk taking that God takes in play,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
where who knows what's going to happen next
Mm.
in a game.
Mm,
Yeah.
Which fits a bit with that nest image, doesn't it?
Yes.
The wee bird just perched on the edge of the nest and they're about to fly for their first game, and what will happen, and
Yes.
the risk in that.
God takes chances. Yes. How about you, Steve?
For me, it was the use of the word "we" at the end, which we said earlier is the Holy Spirit. And I began to wonder whether he was writing this in community. Were there other people who he felt were contributing to the formation of this theological text? Or was he imputing it to God, which of course will raise some interesting questions about the status of which he gives to his theology, or is it that God is an agent in his theology? But I've never seen that word before, and it just helps me put Rupert in a community rather than as an individual theologian.
Yes, that's good. Well, there's lots of responses, and a lot of people related to a delighting game, the love of wisdom, the hilarity in greatness of heart. Yeah, that's a lovely phrase. Hilarity. There's a lot of people finding some response to that. And like me, a game for God, Rob Hanks says. Jane Cunliffe-Jones, a zealous love, a holy love. And Matt Harry, a festive game, a happy game, a delighting game. That cluster of images together, delighting. God and his wisdom, Zemesi says. And there's Alu says a holy love. Jill Farron, hilarity. So there's quite a range of responses there in the Facebook chat, and more than I've just read out. Yes.
So we have, this is a second theologian, and if we go back to that first quote, persecution, prisons, shackled, that can lead to a certain sense of direness. There can be a certain earnestness around theologians in general, and there can be a lot of earnestness around talk of sacraments and what you can and can't do, and how we negotiate lockdown. And in the midst of that theology of the Spirit, here is Rupert, who gives us this frame of game, happy, delighting, festive. And for me, this helps me locate risk. There's natural nervousness about, taking risks, but it's quite helpful to frame it in terms of this festive, delighting happiness. There's a sense of relief in that. There's a sense of playfulness in that. And so as I think about going online, I can get really nervous or tense and worry about the technology and, is my background illuminated appropriately? And am I using my hand gestures too much or whatever? There's a certain release in me and a relief in me when I see this quote and realise that I'm called to participate in this festive, happy game. And I won't get it right, and I'm not meant to get it right, but I'm called to learn and to grow. And so what does it mean for us as a church to be that learning, growing, risk-taking, wondering in this lockdown space?
Yeah,
so that's the theological reflection from that text.
Yes, and it strikes me that at the moment, a number of places in Victoria have been told they have to wear masks every time they go out in public, even to take the rubbish bins in or out. Yeah. And so there's a sense in which that can be felt to be a very serious undertaking. Yeah. But I'm really encouraged by the people who are practicing a spiritual practice of hilarity in that, wearing great masks. And I think of Nicole, one of my colleagues yesterday, who put one of her masks on her Facebook page to show that there was some connection with people around her because of what she was wearing. So that's a useful spiritual practice, embodied practice that goes alongside our anxiety.
Yeah. And in terms of your original question around dispersed, that obviously is a dispersed practice.
Yes.
That's how we live and engage and be in our communities and in our streets. Yes. And that comes from this faith formation dispersed.
Very good.
So that's an 11th century theologian. And of course, I just want to briefly locate this in relation to a contemporary theology. I'm aware that potentially I'm speaking to folk from the Uniting Church. And so for me, I locate this in terms of the basis of union. I locate this in terms of paragraph 11, which finishes with fresh words and deeds. And so what might it mean for the Spirit to be at work in this locked down space in ways that might open up fresh words and deeds? And I was struck reading it again this morning. The church prays that it may be ready when occasion demands to confess the Lord in fresh words and deeds. And that word demand suggests it's external. There's something happening outside the church which is demanding a confession of fresh words and deeds. And so perhaps that's one way to think about COVID, that it's an external demanding which is inviting this fresh words and deeds. And so our response is to turn to the Spirit who is at work, and our response is to do this in terms of as a festive game, a happy game, a delighting game in terms of words and deeds. So that's sort of a contemporization, if you like, of that in terms of how I understand faith formation and dispersal around this ongoing cultivation of fresh words and deeds. But of course, paragraph, that's at the end of paragraph 11, and it's located within scholarly interpreters and the paragraph before Reformation witnesses. So the fresh words and deeds is not a do whatever you want, but it's located in terms of the tradition of the church. And here is Rupert of Dutz, part of the tradition of the church, that might help us think theologically about what it might mean to practice dispersed faith practices.
Yeah, that's good.
Thank you.
I'm wondering if people might want to comment in the Facebook chat now about what this sparks off for them out of this conversation. And we'll just give it a couple of minutes. And while we're doing that, just remind me a couple of the books that you've referred to so far, and I'll see if I can add that to the chat.
Yes, so I could, I've got them all in various places on my computer. My preference would be to send them through at the end.
Sure,
for folk, and we can, because with Facebook chat, you can still add a comment in afterward, can't you?
We can, that's right.
So
people will be patient.
So in terms of references and that, very happy to do that.
Yes. No worries. Okay, so I'm just looking to see if people have got any comments they'd like to make, any questions or things that this is sparking for them in the Facebook chat.
Very good.
And while we're waiting, Steve, just so what is the impact of the coronavirus meant for you and your situation there? You've had some time away from the office, working from home, in extreme lockdown, and then gradual re-entry. What's happened for you? Yeah,
so New Zealand went into full lockdown late of mid-March. And so we all had to work from home, and we've ended up having to run a complete one-day reflection day with our interns to learn to do that online. And then we've also had, we have a block course intensives, had a 9-day block course intensive, so which happened late June, and we were still in transition out, but for health and safety reasons, we made the decision to try and do that fully online. So that was 9 days of experimentation. And now we're just starting to, as a team, I think this is our second week back together. So it's been interesting to go through that in a whole variety of ways, and particularly the levels and going through them up and down and trying to calculate, not even sure what next week will bring. And the rapid changes and adjustments that folk have had to make in terms of how many people can gather, can't gather, and changes in that. And I think quite a bit of tension, therefore, within the church, strong voices calling for freedom and justice and liberation, and This is our government protest moment. Other voices calling for caution and for care for the elderly in particular. So quite strong fractures opening up within the church in terms of how we might respond to this as well.
Yes. Well, I can say that we've had a few comments. So David Hyam talks about the freedom of just letting things happen, not trying to be perfect. And that came out of our conversation with Bex Lewis earlier.
Okay.
That was quite a big learning point and a freeing point for us in terms of our spiritual practices. Jane Cunliffe-Jones, it's exciting that we can be challenged to try mission differently via online media.
Yep.
So not just daunting, but exciting. Christopher Walker, amid the heaviness of the pandemic, how can we offer some lightness?
Yeah.
And David Hyam talks about having a great service where one lady joined in from a hospital bed. That's a good experience. Bruce Crowell, we often use joy in prayers and liturgy, but we don't often see it perhaps in life. And Rupert gives a good reminder of the joy of being with God. That's it. And Maria Koch up in Canberra, to realise the hilarity in a situation brings that sense of relief and sparks resilience. And Judy Redmond, it brings me back to my concern about the pressure to return face-to-face worship at significant environment cost when we could be looking at fresh words and deeds, new ways of having the Spirit within us. And there's Catherine. She's enjoyed the Zoom fellowship meetings. I like the take and playfulness, Bill Lang says, but a lot of the music, songs coming out of people's experience seems to be of lament and being sad. I would love to see something refreshing. So that's an interesting thing, the tension between lament and celebration. We might pick up later on. And Jane talks about how fellowship has actually really moved along with around prayer and so on. So there we are. There's a few comments for us to spin off.
And I wonder what Rupert would think, us using his theology over 1,000 years later to help us through the particularity of the context that we find ourselves in. But certainly that comment around the playfulness and the liberation it is why we call this thing play and faith and formation, because we're trying to encourage that. So it's great to have that resonance picked up. And a number of people commenting on the Spirit and the new things that are emerging. And so what does it mean to pay attention to that, the gift of the Spirit in new ways, and for us to seek to continue to follow that rather than just revert back to old patterns.
Yes. So, and we see it, there's quite a range across the church, as you said, in New Zealand. And here in Australia, some parts of Australia are opening up, Northern Territory, Queensland, and so on. And Tasmania, where there's a lot more freedom to start re-emerging, blending what they've learnt in lockdown and experimenting as they go back. Whereas in Melbourne, metropolitan Melbourne, and so on, we're now still restricted into what we can do. No gathered worship, for example. But we're seeing a lot of creativity at the same time around how people are experimenting, finding ways of loving the play space. So what have you noticed about how people are experimenting with online faith formation in the last few weeks?
So a couple of 3 points I wanted to pick up. And firstly, this is framed in that sense of, the occasion demands it, which is picked up on that basis of union phrase. The occasion has demanded, has enforced or invited fresh ways of being God active. One of the things I did very early on was I began to do short video interviews. I called them Ministry in Isolation video interviews with people who I thought were trying some interesting things. And one of the things that struck me with those interviews was how important the tradition of the church was in terms of helping people think about how they might respond in terms of the new context. So one I did was with Nikki Watkin, and who's a minister in Auckland, and every Good Friday they have a walk around the place, carrying the cross with other churches. And obviously they couldn't do that because of lockdown, but she says that process of Stations of the Cross, that is something that has worked in the tradition of the church. And so she devised a neighbourhood Stations of the Cross using podcast. And what struck me wasn't just the use of technology, but it was her saying the stations have worked in the past. And so that's something that I can call on in terms of bringing things forth. So one place to go immediately is into our tradition and what has helped us, and to think about how that can recreate us. The second thing I've noticed is that good educators shine, whether they're face-to-face or online. Because a lot of online faith formation is simply about good small group skills. And so as you just naturally transition your good small group skills online, then there's just a transference. I was doing a workshop with the Western Australian Presbytery, and someone said, "Oh, this is just like good teaching." Like, bing, yeah, of course it is. It's just good online communication skills. So if you care about safe space face-to-face, then you'll care about safe space online and be thinking about how you're going to create safe space online, not because it's new or different, but simply because you care about safe space. If you care about participation face-to-face, you'll care about participation online. And so there's a sense that being online brings that out. It brings out our best. Equally, it can bring out our worst. If you're into monologue face-to-face, then the online will amplify your monologue, and people will turn off faster, because that's the way that the online medium works. So that's the second thing, is that good educators shine. And so there is a need for us, I think, just to be reminding ourselves, what are our 5 good small group skills? And then what would they look like online is the second thing. And the third thing I've noticed is the different way the visual medium works. And I'm going to try and tell you this, or demonstrate this with hopefully a visual medium. So this is one of our interns. And they were invited to do a presentation, and without any warning, in the middle of the presentation, they start to burn part of their script. And of course, my anxiety as an educator goes up until I suddenly realise that I'm actually a screen away. So the direct health and safety implications are no longer mine. They're purely the students. But it's astonishing to suddenly have that happen in the visual medium. And of course, because it's in a visual medium, that takes up the entirety of the screen. And so it looks quite dramatic. But then what happened next was really interesting, because the person took the ash and they collected it down below on the surface of their laptop. And so if you imagine that your laptop is there, and then the person bent down the laptop so that you could see with their video camera the ash. And suddenly the entire screen is filled with about a 5 by 5 centimetre focus of the video camera. And then they turned the ash into the shape of the cross as some words were read. And it was an incredibly powerful use of visuals, where suddenly the entire screen is captured by something that's happening in a 5 by 5 centimetre space. And I sat there thinking, that wouldn't be nearly as powerful if that was face-to-face. If that was face-to-face, then I'd be at distance from that. If that was face-to-face and I was in a church, I'd be in a pew and I wouldn't be able to see what's going on. If I was really technically smart, I could have rigged up a video camera in my face-to-face performance to show us, but I'd still be watching a screen quite some distance away. And so it would still be removed and I'd be seeing a whole lot of distraction. But because of the immediacy of the screen and the size of the screen, then there are different ways of engaging visually and much more powerfully. And so I think I'm starting to see people use visual in different ways and in different mediums. So that's some of the experimenting that I've seen, some of the potentially fresh ways, as it were, that people are starting to work and engage in this online space.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. Uh, Annika and I have been teaching sacraments for the last 4 weeks, and Craig and I have been running a course on generosity over the last 2 months.
Yep.
And in each of those, we've really enjoyed the conversation that emerges out of that. And part of our learning was that actually the principles of a flipped classroom apply in that setting as well, online Zoom as well. So it's saying, well, look, we don't actually have to do the reading for people or summarize everything in that setting, but to allow people to have the experience of hearing other perspectives, reflecting on their own stories, being able to bring the questions that they have and hear each other's perspectives on those.
Yeah.
It's been great.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I've noticed is that in an online environment, there's a discipline about stopping and taking a break. And we're trying to do that every 50 minutes, so that there's a sense in which people can ground themselves. They can get some sunlight if there's any sunlight, but being able to keep fresh in that environment.
Yeah. And I think there's something around the ability of online to capture material, to record material, which then allows people to participate at a different time. So a couple of years ago, I was going to teach a class, and 80% of the participants couldn't turn up. And it's like, oh no, what's this going to be like? So I emailed the 2 people who were left, and I said, we could cancel this and try and postpone this, or the 3 of us could do it. We could video it, and then people could catch it up later. And people email later on commenting on how rich the conversation was. Because they could listen to it later and engage later. And you set a little exercise, they have to feed back. But it occurred to me that, the ease of doing that is just one click. Whereas if it had been a face-to-face gathering, then would I have bothered to get the video gear and set it up, and how would you get the microphones and everything? Whereas the ease of the online made that level of engagement much more rich and meaningful.
Yes, true. And it's a bit of a learning curve, encouraging the next step beyond watching, which is what we do with television, to interacting like we're doing today. And I think of my own congregation, Kim Kane, who's one of the ministry team there. He puts regular photography online with prayers and reflections, good theological reflection. And twice a week we have Lectio Divina, a readings and prayers, and people do watch at the same time or later on. But the growth point I think for our congregation is learning how to interact with that, and because we're not used to, when we turn up in person, actually talking back during the service. It's just not possible. But now we actually have the point where we're able to discover what a lot of people are thinking and wondering about. It's a great gift. Yes. So you've been involved in online learning and teaching for some time. So can you tell us a bit more about the underlying aspects of that?
So a couple of things that have helped me. Firstly, this is a moment in our online block course. So this went for 9 days. Normally face-to-face in our KCML block courses, forming ministers of the word. We have 3 times a day, we have a spiritual practice, devotion in the morning, prayers of intercession for the world during the midday, and then an examine in the evening. And this was what I helped to design in terms of the midday prayer. And so if you can see in this top box here, before the block course began, I sent everyone a box that had a range of physical, tactile takeaways. And what this meant is that it created an immediate call and response, if you like, in terms of the actions of being engaged. Just let me go and grab something. So since it was 9 days, and since some people live in dark spaces, everyone got sent a little lamp. And so the beginning ritual of the day was the invitation to turn on your lamp. And the physical gesture of seeing the class reach over and turn on the lamp was a bit like the call to worship. And so the embodiment of that creates a call and response. And then the prayers for the world, people were sent a globe. They're invited to hold the globe, to point to somewhere where it's hurting. And then we did a responsive call and response prayer. It hurts, and people name different places that it hurts. And so that trying to be aware that the digital world is still an embodied world, and that every person I talk to is still a body in exactly the same way as they are a body if they're in the face-to-face context. And how can I encourage, call forth, attend to the body of the person, which continues therefore a form of embodiment in terms of learning. So when they hold the globe at the same time as I hold the globe, there's a sense of shared embodied prayer that's going on together, and it creates a different dynamic. So that's one thing I'm constantly thinking about, is what's the practical tactile thing that I can engage with to help that interaction. Now, it could be that you aren't physically able to send a globe or send something. And so in that case, I'll be thinking, what is in their home?
Yep.
What do they already have that might be involved? And so our Old Testament lecturer was working with Isaac and that story. And so they invited people to think about, what instrument in their house might be applicable in that story. Take 5 minutes, go and find it and bring it back, and we'll talk about it. And suddenly that Bible story lives in people's lives and in people's homes in a very different way than if you were face-to-face in a church building, where you couldn't invite people to go to their homes, go to their kitchens, go to their lounges. And so that awareness of embodiment, the awareness of the use of takeaways, I think is a part of this dispersed faith formation that actually pushes us into people's lives and invites engagement with the story in some quite different ways. So that's the first thing. Practically, think about takeaways. The second thing is about participation. We've already briefly mentioned that. But what ways am I going to constantly encourage participation? And there are polls, there's chat, there's online whiteboards. There are a whole lot more ways to interact online than just through the video camera. There's a person called Gretchen Macleod in her work Because of the Internet. She's a linguist. She also writes for Wired magazine, which is one of the chief technological magazines. And she argues that the internet is a new language, and people are learning to speak in new ways. That cell phone texts and social media posts and group chat are actually what she calls an informal way of writing. They're not formal, it's informal, and so it's mapping a different way of speaking together. And so it's how do we start to think about inviting people, allowing people to participate in those informal ways. We ran a thing called bubble courses, which were 1 hour online experiments. My first evening, there were 43 people turned up online. The screen is a Zoom screen is just a mass of faces that I can't engage with. I went back and I analysed the chat function afterward, and in the 60 minutes, there were 150 distinct comments in the chat function. That's an average of 1 comment every 25 seconds. And then I looked at the different type of people that commented, and 31 different folk made chat comments. That's out of a group of 43 people. So that's 73% had some meaningful participation during that hour. And that would never happen in a face-to-face service. but the chat function allows that type of engagement. Checking the gender balance. The gender balance was exactly 50-50 in terms of who commented. And so different people were responding. It was pulling out the whole people of God in a whole different way. So think about that interaction and go on a journey of thinking about new ways that you can learn to interact. The third thing I'm noticing and wanting to explore further is what I call a vocal immediacy. And this struck me when we were doing worship together with our interns. Because online you can only see people's face, you can't see the movements that are going on around them. And what that means is that you don't see people prepare to read scripture. So when you say, could you read, it's likely to go bang and immediately. You don't have to wait for the person to stand up, find their Bible, walk to the front, open it and read. And so there's a much more interesting, vocal immediacy that's happening. And the power of hearing someone's voice coming at you is in quite a different way, quite an unexpected way almost. Now, the flip side of that is that therefore things can actually move faster. And so we need to think about how to slow things down to allow pace. If people have got voices, they need to stop.
That's exactly right. And while you're thinking there, Steve, there's a couple of people in the chat that are reflecting on not everybody's confident in chatting. There's the two-finger syndrome where people are two-finger typers and it takes a while. But the other thing is that some people are phoning in, and I think this vocal immediacy might relate to that. Have you got any thoughts on that? Yeah,
so I'm interested in, I saw online last week, there's a vocal chat where some technology is starting to be used that arranges conversations according to people's voices. So it's a chat function, but it's a voiced function. And so you give people the website and they speak their voice, which is captured on MP3. And so you hear people's voices going through a conversation. And I think that's got some really interesting possibilities for people who are two-finger typists. But it also means that you're actually hearing a voice, which is a different form of embodiment and engagement than the use of fingers. So I'm happy to pop that website in as part of the resources at the end. But yeah, that to me, that's an exciting space.
Yep, I love it when my family on Facebook chat. Every now and then someone will record their voice saying something, and it is really lovely.
And I've even started to do it, in my team. That sometimes you've got some things you want to say in an email, and it's going to take a while to get it down. You don't need them to respond immediately, so record your voice on the MP3, send them an email. They can listen to it in their own time. They're hearing you and your inflections and your pause and your diffidence. And so the tone of the conversation becomes quite different. So those are sort of some practical things I'm noticing. A couple of frames, if you like, that I use. One is the synchronous, asynchronous frame. The fact that video potentially forces us to be here and now. But people also do work in different ways in different spaces. Extroverts are better in the synchronous, introverts are better in the asynchronous. And so how do I set up a learning space that might encourage both of those? And of course, if you apply that to church services, we're often in the synchronous domain. We expect people to turn up face-to-face at a certain time. And if you're there an hour later, bad luck, you've missed out. And so what does it mean to start to think about faith formation in dispersed ways that include the synchronous and the asynchronous? And so that's just a framework, a teaching framework that I'm using. And this is the other framework I'm using. Again, it's not new, but the fact that people respond in different ways. Some people do, some people make, some people speak, some people write. And I used this with our team, our faculty team. We were, suddenly faced with 9 consecutive days of teaching online, and we didn't have a lot of experience with it. And so the asynchronous, synchronous frame. How could we use that? And then this doing, making, speaking, writing. And I sat down and I analysed what I would normally teach and realised that everything I was doing was in that speaking frame. I was either talking to students or I was inviting students to talk amongst themselves or to talk back to me. And so even though I was thinking I was participative, I'd actually tunneled my teaching down into this one domain. And so it was quite a salutary exercise then to do some brainstorming around how could I encourage people to do, make and write. And suddenly my entire lecture plan began to change. And so that's, again, an educational framework that I think has lots of relevance. If you analyse most Bible studies, they're probably full of speaking. So how could I fill out that space to encourage different ways of engaging, and what type of faith formation possibilities would that open up? So that's just some background thinking, some teaching frameworks that I found useful in terms of thinking about faith formation and dispersed contexts.
That's very good. There's a number of comments people are relating to this, and people thinking about how different platforms make it possible to have good vocal chat, for example. So, and clearly Zoom has part of that, but also Discord, someone's mentioning, as a platform that a lot of younger adults are using. But this Rob talks about the synchronous asynchronous frame being a helpful reminder that we don't have to do everything at once.
Yeah.
And there's, for example, right at the moment, there's a conference on climate change and pastoral care, and people can log in and out of that. But it also, when we talk about 9 days of intensive, well, that's a long time.
Yeah.
You don't have to be on screen all that time. There's a lot of stuff that can happen.
Yeah. Yeah, so that was the real challenge and the real learning for our team. So basically we said we're going to have to halve the amount of time that we spend allowing students to be with us. So we took what would normally be 7 hours and said it's only going to be 3 hours maximum over the day. And then the second thing we did was we said to ourselves as faculty, can we discipline ourselves to only require 1 hour of synchronous engagement with us? Yeah, have a go. You might not be able to do it, but for the first week, try and plan your lectures, imagining you can only spend up to an hour max talking with a student. Use that grid, fill it out. And it was astonishing how with that enforced constraint, as the occasion demands, there was fresh words and deeds in terms of our lecturing practice. And we spread it out over time. And at the end of it, one of my colleagues said to me, I now have the confidence that I know I can offer spiritual formation online because of the range, because of the interaction, because of the comments. So they're mixed. We've still got some learning and growth to do. And I'm not saying that all formation should be online, but there were some things that we did that we could only do because we were online with students, and some tensions that were raised that you could only engage in the reality of being enforced at home, which invited fresh thinking about the nature of formation.
Yes. And of course, one of the byproducts of that is that you're really encouraging people to embody spiritual practices themselves rather than just talk about it.
Yeah.
They're actually doing stuff. They're talking to people, they're engaging.
Yeah. And it has to be done in the reality of their home.
Yes.
If you go on a block course, it's an artificial environment. Home fades away. And so, of course, you can turn up to pray because everyone else is turning up to pray. But at home, the doorbell might go. You might be distracted by your internet feed. You might be hungry. And so what are the rhythms and practices you're going to put in place to make that part of your regular life? And suddenly that's the real work of formation rather than the artificialness of an enforced learning environment. So I'm not arguing for fully online all the time, but what I am saying is that there are some generative learning moments. The Spirit is swooping and the Spirit is at work and inviting growth in different and in fresh ways.
Yeah, that's very good. And a lot of what we're talking about is being blended. We're actually bringing together different practices. And the chart you had up there before, which we'll share later on as well with notes that people can have a look at, the doing, making, speaking, and writing is a blended exercise in itself that we were using before COVID-19 in ways of helping people bridge to different ways of learning, even in a classroom or in a Bible study. But there's the sense of choice, the sense of access, using different modes of operating. It's not either or, it's both and, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so this is all taking the principles of good learning and applying them to the mix between online and at home as well.
Yeah, and that framework came straight from an assessment guide
Yes.
from a university of higher education institution that's trying to shift their faculty toward more different ways of learning. There's 50 different activities that were labelled in underneath that. And so when you got stuck, you could just go and look at those activities and think, oh, that might work. No, that won't work. Yeah, and so it's just taking what is good education and thinking about it in terms of the context that we find ourselves in.
Very good. Now, Scott Guyot says, I wonder how we'd run a meeting, like a presbytery meeting or a synod meeting or assembly meeting. Could we imagine a mix, a blend of synchronous and asynchronous, of talking, writing, doing, and making?
And the answer is yes. And if you want someone to actually talk with who's done this, Kerry Enright, who used to work for Uniting World and is now a minister in one of our oldest Presbyterian churches, Knox Presbyterian Church. They had their annual general meeting online about a month and a half ago. They, as part of that, they voted in a new minister to join them. And when they held the induction, the commissioning, the moderator on behalf of the presbytery said that they think this is the first time ever that this has happened. It's been done by the Book of Order, followed the standards. They thought about it really well and really carefully, but they felt, I think they used the words, this is our innovation. We're a traditional church, and this is the innovation that we've entered into in order for this to happen, because we sensed God wanted this process to continue. And we said, why couldn't it continue? And the Book of Order Committee said, if you do this and this, then of course it can continue. So it was a wonderful example of discernment and engagement. Yeah,
it's great. So yes, we had that recently in our presbytery where we needed to elect our standing committee, a new chairperson. So we went through a long process. We called for nominations. We put together profiles that people could read in their own time. We called people to an online Zoom meeting where they could see people speaking, get a sense of what their vision and their heart was. And then we sent people a link to a voting system they could use over 3 days. And then we commissioned them online as well. But if we could have added the having the video to watch later on, which we did for the commissioning. Wendy expresses a concern I often hear, which is, are we in danger of moving to a haves and have-nots? Some people feel more confident in engaging, or even they can because they have technology to engage with a blended approach, and others feel left out. How have you looked at that?
A couple of responses. So I frame that as a justice issue. And the Spirit of God who is swooping in the world is the Spirit of justice, who is committed to access and equality for all. And therefore the good educator that is working hard in a face-to-face environment to make sure that there is equal access. The good educator who says, you've spoken enough now, is there someone else who could speak? The good educator who says, we've heard enough male voices in this conversation. Are there some other perspectives that we need to hear? The good chair who says, we haven't heard any youth voices yet in this discussion. All those practices, that attention to who is and who isn't speaking become part of the online system. So there is injustice online. There's also injustice face-to-face. There are people who, for a range of reasons, can't engage face-to-face. So that's a justice issue with that. So it's not that it's an either or, but it's a both and in terms of that. The other comment I want to make is there's some really interesting research just come out of the university in South Africa, who were forced online because of COVID in South Africa, and researching their students. And they've made some really interesting comments, because quite a few of their students are in the slums and have very limited digital access. And so it's been interesting for me yesterday to be reading through some of their recommendations, and them being basically saying, if access is a problem, don't use synchronous video. There are other ways to engage, use chat. Remind us to pay attention to those digital divides, to not let that stop us being digital, but to encourage us to continue to follow that swooping spirit in terms of how we're going to continue to change our practice to make sure that people are included.
Yeah, that's great. And Lindy Lash says that Wendy Brunswick Uniting Church Brunswick Uniting Church were worried about the socio-economic divide, so they collected old mobile phones and bought plans and gave them away so people could stay on online and engage.
It's a great example, isn't it?
Yes, and we hear about that. There's big projects in continental Africa, India, where this is seen as a justice issue as well.
Yeah. And in Australia, I was friends with someone who did their PhD on digital access and Indigenous cultures in the desert of South Africa, of South Australia, and what that meant for engaging and learning. So digital access is not new; it's just now more visible for us.
Yeah. Okay, let's have a look. I know you've done a bit of writing about this, Steve, and you've had 3 books. There's a bit of a pattern I see in the way you've written. And I remember meeting with you as you were preparing your first one, Out of Bounds Church, Learning to Create a Community of Faith in a Culture of Change, which came out of your PhD, is that right?
Yes.
Your research. And the second one, which was Built for Change, a practical theology of innovation and collaborative leadership, writing about your experience in leadership at Uniting College of Leadership and Theology in Adelaide. And your most recent one, the first expression, Innovation and the Mission of God. So let's talk about some of the things that you're learning around play and experimenting in your work. That's quite a big theme in your work.
Firstly, can I say that the term first expressions came in your lounge in Sydney, Duncan.
Yes.
I was just about to, I think, teach a workshop for you. Oh no, maybe it was the National Ministers Conference.
Oh yes.
And I had been in. I'd done the one in the desert in Charlottesville, and then the next week there was one in Sydney, a multicultural one. And I had asked my daughter if she wanted to join me. And so she flew in and we spent that morning with you, and then we went to the conference, and I did some writing there, and the phrase first expressions, which is there in my book, Innovation and the Mission of God, emerged then. And I was researching sustainability in the emerging church, and first expressions focuses on on the early innovations, on the pioneering. So often those stories aren't told until things either have succeeded or failed, and we look back. But in the very initial stages, there's huge growth, and the Spirit is at work. So I'm interested in that sustainability, and therefore I'm also interested in what we consider as success and how we learn. And in the midst of this engagement and innovation, do we only count what sustains itself long term, and therefore we write off a whole lot of learning, and therefore the subconscious message we send is don't risk unless you know it's going to succeed. And of course you can't know that before you risk, which therefore takes me back to play, and I find play a much more helpful way of thinking about risk rather than those sort of external metrics. Picks up on that work by Rupert of Dutz, who encourage us to play in line with the Spirit. So some images to help me think about this. First is the image of the glass house. And so in the glass house, we are intentionally taking something and we're putting it in an environment and we're creating some opportunities for it to grow. And so what does it mean for us as a church? What does it mean for us as individuals? What does it mean for us as a presbytery to deliberately take things that are risky and new and create places and environments where they might be held and where they might be engaged with? What does it mean to create an ecosystem in terms of our own lives, in terms of the church, where we encourage play by setting aside a glass house and by going, I need to put things in it, I need to water it, I need to open the windows when it gets too hot, I need to watch for bugs, I need to think about how I'm going to transfer that back into the real world, but we're using that as a way of thinking about innovation. And the other image that I found helpful is the image of play. And thinking about sandpits and how sandpits have a border around them. And the adults often stand outside the border with their cup of coffee, chatting together, and they're offering a sort of protection. But inside that is a kid who's having the time of their lives, just playing. There's no agenda for that. There's no sort of set of outcomes. There's just that enjoyment. And so what does it mean for us to think about innovation as play and to create play pens in our lives, to create play pens in our ministries, to create play pens in our presbyteries where people can just play and engage. And this links back for me to the work of Rupert of Doots. He also talks about the role of language learning in terms of the Spirit. So he goes to Pentecost and he notes that where the Spirit was at Pentecost, there was a new language learning. And so here in the 11th century, he therefore says that knowledge of languages would aid in spreading the gospel throughout the world. And so he encouraged scholarship and encouraged language learning in his Benedictine order because of the Spirit at Pentecost, the Spirit at play. And so I then link that to this digital environment, and I think, what would it mean for me to be a person at play? What would it mean for me to say, okay, if Gretchen McCulloch is right, if there is a new language, then is the Spirit at work, Pentecost Spirit at work, inviting a new language learning in terms of the enforced environment that we find ourselves in. And how do you learn a language? You learn language by playing. A couple of nights ago, my wife showed me a picture of our 2-year-old cousin, and he's learning to talk, Steve, and I'm listening really hard, and there's a mumbling going on, and the mum can work out the word and repeats it back, and I've got no idea. And the kid is grinning, and he's having the time of his life. And what would it mean for me to apply that image to how I think about faith formation? It will return me to the words of Jesus. Unless you change and become like little children, then you cannot enter the kingdom of God. So is this a little children moment for the church in which we've been invited to learn a new language? It fits with the way my children interact with me. So one of the interesting things that happens in the online world is that the expertise has shifted generations. And so I'm the child and my children have expertise in terms of this world, in terms of this culture. And so a couple of weeks ago, my daughter direct messaged me on Twitter saying, Dad, you're meant to be replying to tweets, not retweeting them. And it looks like you're having a go at them when you're trying to engage them in conversation. And so there's my daughter teaching me what it means to play in terms of the online world, or to personalise the words of Jesus in Matthew. Steve Taylor, unless you change, become like a little children and learn from your daughters who know the language better than you won't enter into this new space, which again takes us back to our Rupert of Dutes. This is a game for God. Therefore, this is a game for God's creation. This is a festive game. It's a happy game. It's a delighting game. And so I am invited to enter into this new language learning, this new space. Just one final little theological piece on this. Wanda Szewski, who's done the research on Rupert of Dutes, looks at the way that God's language works. And she has this quote about God's language is in an atmosphere of worship, which is then described using Gadamer's phrase as a game that plays the use of language. And so that, for me, puts again another spiritual faith formation frame on this, that I'm entering into this online world in the atmosphere of worship. I'm playing in the atmosphere of worship. Faith formation dispersed is occurring in the atmosphere of worship, the invitation to play. So will I resist lockdown because I'm an adult, because I don't like learning new things, because I don't want to look silly in front of people, or in God's grace, will I enter lockdown and digital dispersed learning as being called into God's game, to practice my online ABCs, to rehearse and to fumble. And again, that takes me away from the technical, is my video camera set up and what's my Zoom screen background, and invites me into the atmosphere of worship, of language learning, which is framed in terms of mission, knowledge of language so that God's Spirit can extend. This is a new language, and so play and mission and faith formation get woven together in terms of my response and my practices.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that. That's good to be able to reflect on the play being encouraged in the sandpit, so to speak. And I have great memories of the sandpit.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, Tonka toys and sandpits, and that's where I learned to get on with my younger brother, sharing the sandpit and not throwing toys out of the sandpit. All kinds of things come out of that, and part of that is also when we talk about play and learning how to engage. And you mentioned your daughter giving you hints about how you actually play with the Twitter sphere. There's a sense in which we're having to learn how it works and learning from others, observing others, how they play. There's a temptation, I think we sometimes feel, to actually bring people on in line and say, well, come on, this is how you do it. And you're breaking the rules right now by doing what you're doing. There's a natural sense of, well, actually, it would work much better if you did this.
Yeah.
But I think one of the challenges we have is the need for generosity towards one another as we learn to take some risks and try some things out. Particularly intergenerational learning, where we think, hey, you're too old to be working in this space, or in the same way that young people are often thought to be too young to work in a space. There's a bit of learning to actually be gracious to one another.
And we're all, 2-year-olds online.
Yes.
Yeah. So we've spent all our adult lives learning how to read people's faces face to face and read their body language face to face. And so we've got enormous skill and capacity that we've subconsciously developed. When I walk into a face-to-face room, there's a whole lot of embedded practices that I'm not even aware of, that I've honed in terms of where I stand and checking the windows are set up and making sure I've got my notes organised and remembering people's names and looking them in the eye. Those are just embedded practices. Suddenly we're all 2-year-olds. And of course, it's not going to go as well the first time. And of course, it's going to be more tiring because we're going flat out and we're like 2-year-olds who need a little nap. And so that's the context of giving the entire thing space. Of course, our online church worship won't be as good as the face-to-face, not because face-to-face is better. It's just that we haven't learnt the language enough yet to be competent in terms of how it's being used.
Yes. So being gracious with ourselves. There's a sense of which takes time, and 2-year-olds, you've got a whole year of being 2.
Yeah.
And a
Yeah.
whole year of being 3, and
Yeah.
learning new stuff all the time. And by the time you get to an organised school environment, you have had 5 years of significant learning
Mhm.
because you've been doing stuff, you've been making stuff, you've been listening, trying things out, discovering language, making up languages.
Yeah.
That's all fun. Not all fun, but it's definitely all play. And there's a sense of the Spirit being with us in that.
Yeah, so one of our reflections is that we need to therefore try and scaffold into our formation learning some skills before we can actually start.
Yes.
Yeah, so because the student comes with, and they're anxious about where will they find stuff on Moodle and how to turn the thing on, and so they're more anxious in the room alongside their already existing anxieties about adult education and family and all their stresses. So if we say before we start the online class a week beforehand, we're going to spend some time just learning some technology and practicing together, having a conversation, then that decreases the anxiety when we then move into a different faith formation setting. And so that also, how do we attend to the skills that people don't have in gracious, open, hospitable ways? Yeah.
Yes, I'm very lucky to have a family. We meet together every day on Facebook Live. We talk to each other, but we try out some new platforms and we teach each other how to use them. So whiteboarding, for example, you mentioned earlier, just the sense of playfulness that we can have with that.
Yeah.
And Snapchat, of course, was I guess it's still around, but that was a playful medium in itself.
Yeah.
Being able to play around with your faces.
Yeah. Yeah, there was some research done in the UK 2 weeks after they went into lockdown of educational facilitators asking them what they'd learned in the 2 weeks.
Yep.
And the dominant learning was how many of them had gone into multiple platforms at once.
Yes.
They'd realised that no one platform does everything. And I think it was earlier on, Rob made the comment about different platforms having different modes. And so rather than either or, they mixed them together and were using in different ways. And I did initially talk with Craig about, could we, because we've got 2 platforms going here. We've got a Zoom and a Facebook platform going on. Could we add in a whiteboard platform so people could do post-it notes rather than the Lectio?
Yes.
Yeah, so, and it's that sense of playfulness and experimenting.
Let's just come to we've got another 8 minutes left, but let's just do some reflection on coming back to what we talked about earlier, about the Spirit sweeping down, the gift of community, and the possibilities for learning and playing as a community. And one of the things I think we have to learn is that playing with technology is not unspiritual. Playing with technology is actually it's not removed from real life. It is actually real. It's not a resemblance of something, but it's actually a way in which we're engaging with one another as real people. And the Holy Spirit is real in the way we interact. Have you had any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's been more important to use the word making.
Yes.
And therefore to see the digital world as part of that making.
Yes.
Yeah. So God is a maker. I'm made in the image of God. And in Revelation 22, God is making all things new. In the Great Commission, make disciples.
Yeah.
It's not a technological process. It's a making process. And so therefore, what does it mean for me to see these types of conversations? What does it mean for me to see my blog, my writing? I've got an online community practice that I've started. I've never run that before, and I might not be good enough and it might not work, but I'll have a crack. And so we've got people all over the world who are themselves making around nurturing online formation in that community of practice. And we realise we need friends, we need supporters, we need your younger brother in the sandpit, as it were. And so we come alongside as collaborators and support each other as we explore together. So yeah, so that word making for me is important. And there are lots of biblical themes that resonate around that. God in the Old Testament is framed as a maker. God is a weaver. God is a knitter. God is a design architect. So it's easy then to see technology as an extension of that making activity of God.
And that might provide us with a connection with the environmental conference happening this week, of the Holy Spirit hovering over the waters at the very beginning with the void, before, as God began to form the world, to be the maker, and inviting us to be part of that making and creating.
Yeah, and it therefore says that we will not solve our problems by technology, and therefore placing ourselves as the anthropomorphic center of the environmental crisis, but as God makes in the world, what does it mean for us to participate in ways that extend God's creation care? And so there is that there. The other interesting thing about the conference is that because of technology, I get to pray for that conference. So the conference organisers on Facebook said, we're going online. Would people like to pray online? And so I get daily email reminders in my Facebook to pray for that conference that we're now talking about, which wouldn't have happened in a face-to-face way. So I feel connected with that, even though, because of the digital world. So it's an interesting, how things are shifting and changing.
Yes. Rob Hanks says, digital pottery wheels, artworks for prayers, crafted in text, vision and interaction. I met 5 people for the first time in my newly started placement by Zoom coffee. And Judy Redmond met her entire congregation for the first time online, going on to make more connections. So connections are made, that they don't just happen. And the Spirit is intricately involved in all of that. Yes.
We should go back to Rupert of Duke, shouldn't we?
That would be great.
As the centurion Cornelius was shut out, locked down by Jews, prohibiting Gentiles from receiving, to say nothing of the many baptized who, confessing Christ under persecution, were not able to reach the waters, kept away by prisons, shackled with chains. At length the mother, the grace of God, who extends her wings beyond the nest of the waters, flies forth to her own as the Holy Spirit swooped down on all who were listening to the word when Peter was preaching. Before it came into being was a game for God and God's wisdom, a festive game, a happy game, a delighting game, but truly to rejoice at such things, to see all this with a hilarity in greatness of heart, is the love of wisdom, a zealous love, a holy love, which we said earlier is the Holy Spirit.
Thank you for that. And that's been a delight to be in this conversation today. And
a festive delight.
That has been excellent. And we look forward to the ongoing conversation on the Facebook chat. It's not finished. It'll continue for a while. This video will be there once we finish the conversation. It'll be available for people to see asynchronously. And you'll be able to participate in the chat as well, Steve, putting in your references. And we look forward to ongoing conversation. And we know from experience that we might have 3 or 4 times the number of people who watch later than were there in person on live. So we look forward to people sharing the video and having the continuing conversation.
Thank you for having me. I'll put up the references. If you want to, buy my book.
Yes,
but
it's a good
I'll
read.
continue to interact with you. Thanks.
Yes.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Steve.